Hello, today in this programme I'm going to show you how to do a single thumb twist cast on. There are lots of different ways of casting on in knitting, and there's different reasons for using these different cast ons. This particular cast on, the single thumb twist, gives you a very soft, flexible edge. So, for example, if you want to start with a lace pattern, as I've got in my hand here, and also on the bottom of this garment next to me, in order to allow the knitting to stretch, the cast on edge to stretch around this scallop shape, it's important to have a flexible cast on. And as you can see, I can stretch it quite easily. So it will sit nicely when the piece is finished. It's also useful for other knitting techniques where the knitting is spread sideways. This is a sample of knitting using a technique called knit one below, and because of the way the knitting is formed, it spreads sideways, so you want a bottom edge that will spread as much as the knitting and not hold it in. To start this cast off, you just make a slip knot with your yarn and place it on your right needle. I'm placing it on a circular needle because I usually use circular needles to knit with, but the needle that you're holding in your right hand. So I've got the slip knot on the needle in my right hand, and the yarn that's attached to the ball is on my left hand side. I'm now going to wrap the yarn clockwise around my thumb and then slip it onto the right needle. So I wrap it around my thumb, put the point through the loop, and then tighten it up against the needle. So again, wrap it clockwise around my thumb, put the stitch onto the loop. I find this the easiest way to do it. So I'm holding the yarn in my left hand to give it some tension. You can work it around a finger as well, but I find it much easier to work it this way. So it's just a very simple loop that's being put onto the right needle. Once you've put on as many loops as you need for the number of stitches you need to cast on, you do need to be careful in the first row of knitting. Quite often people have a problem knitting the first row, as I'll show you. So I knit the first stitch. If I pull my hands away from each other, you tend to get a long loop forming between the stitches. So it is important when you knit the first row of this cast on that you don't pull your hands apart. If you keep on pulling them apart like this loop gets longer and longer, and eventually you'll end up with a big long loop in the middle of your knitting, which is not what we're trying to get. So as you knit the first row, just keep the needles fairly close together. I tend also to use the left index finger just to open up the stitch slightly to give it a bit more give so I can get my right needle in as I'm knitting the first row. So I've just got a few more stitches to do here now. One and one more. Right. So now I can stretch the stitches down the needle, and you can see that there is quite a bit of flexibility in the cast on once we've worked the first row. If I just knit another row just to show you how the edge will look. It does give you a nice flexible edge, but sometimes it does require a little bit of care, both with the casting on as you're wrapping it, as you're moving it onto the needle, and also with the knitting of the first row. So when I get back to the end of this row, so that gives me the first 2 rows knitted after the cast on. On the sample that I worked here, I actually knitted 3 rows of garter stitch so that I had the other side of the cast on visible along my bottom edge. The reason for doing that was I'm knitting garter stitch as a bottom edge. If I just started knitting the lace pattern without having some rows of garter stitch first, the knitting would curl up. So you need something to keep it balanced. So I knitted some rows of garter stitch first, and I decided I preferred having the slightly raised bump side of the cast on visible rather than the alternative side, which is looped down. But you can make your own decisions, whatever project you're actually working on at the time. So that's called a single thumb twist cast on, or a loop cast on, it's sometimes called. It'll give you a nice soft edge and is very good for starting lace projects and for any kind of pattern that requires the knitting to be spreading sideways. I'll be demonstrating some more cast-ons another time, so see you then. Goodbye.